Hello, welcome to Outback Power's summer webinar series. My name is Gwendolyn Espy. I'm an applications engineer here at Outback Power, and today we're going to be talking about UL1741 SA. This webinar will be about 30 minutes long, so let's get started. Here is an overview of what we will be talking about today. The first thing is, what is SA? Maybe you've been hearing about it. So we'll be going over what does that mean. Second is what's the timing of all of this? So how does this affect you? And lastly, we'll be talking about Outback Solutions. All right, first is what is SA? SA is in reference to UL1741 SA, Standard for Safety Inverters, Converters, Controller, and interconnection systems equipment for use with distributed energy resources. Wow, that's a mouthful. And it's the test standard by which we certify inverters to. So the SA part is an annex. It's an addition to UL 1741. So we use UL 1741 SA to test that we meet HECO Rule 14H requirements, which is Hawaii, and that we meet California Rule 21 requirements. So I have a little bit of an analogy of how to describe this relationship here. All right, here we go. So let's say that you need people that can jump 3 feet, okay? And I need people that can jump 6 feet. So we both need people that can jump, but our values, our requirements are a little bit different. So what we can do is we can point to a test standard. And the test standard might say something like, okay, you can't use a trampoline, you can't jump off a diving board, you all have to use the same shoe, there's no special shoes you can use, and you have to jump off from cement into sand, and you each get a 30-foot running head start. So this is how we're going to test people to verify that you're going to get your 3 feet and 6 feet. So to try to tie this back into HECO and California Rule 21 and UL 1741 SA. So let's say that HECO is saying, hey, we need 3 feet. California says, California Rule 21 says we need 6 feet. And they're both pointing to UL 1741 SA, which is that test standard. So they both need people, or inverters in this case, but they both need people that can jump, but they both have unique requirements. So, HECO might need, I forget what I said, but HECO might need, a certain amount of feet, and California might need the other feet. So that's kind of an analogy that I have to kind of describe that relationship. All right, so a high percentage of PV in certain markets have potential to create additional strain on the electrical grid. So these states have asked for help from the interconnected inverters. And that's really key. So remember, this is for interconnected inverters. Starting September 8th, new installations in Hawaii and California require inverters to be listed as providing grid support or smart inverter functions. Grid support or smart inverter at this point are synonymous, but so for now on, I'll refer it to mostly as grid support. This is for inverters that will be interconnected, remember. So that includes battery-based and grid tie inverters. So we have several levels and types of standards. We have local agreements, we have state laws, test standards, and finally IEEE 1547, which is a voluntary industry standard. UL 1741 SA is an update to the test standard to test these new requirements determined by California Rule 21, HECO, and then possibly more state utility laws. So states wanted these functions, but they didn't want to wait for the new IEEE 1547. So they took action, which in turn, the test standard UL 1741 SA was developed. IEEE 1547 is at the tail end of developing their standard, and it should be released at the end of this year or at the beginning of next year. And in the future, it's possible that California Rule 21 and UL 1741, they may refer to IEEE 1547 once it's released. I want to start off the slide saying that these new requirements are a big change. it's everything turned upside down on its head. So we have these two kind of problem statements in two different categories. We have ride-throughs, and then we have voltage regulation and power functions. So for ride-throughs, inverters were mandated to be twitchy. If they were slightly out of range required by previous versions of standards, they were to immediately disconnect, trip offline, and be on a 5-minute timer. The band was so narrow, inverters were so reactionary. They really couldn't keep doing what they were doing, so now we have ride-throughs. The inverter now must stay connected for a period of time and then disconnect by a period of time as well. Now inverters not only wait it out a little bit longer, but they also support the grid during those disturbances. As more solar is installed in a region, it raises the voltage of that local grid. So now we're talking about voltage regulation and power functions. So each area has a voltage limit. As you stuff the area with solar, you are reaching that limit, and then some areas are already seeing that, like in California. Well, our inverters can do something about it, but they were never allowed to. Previously, utilities mandated, thou shall not regulate voltage. Now with grid support functions in the new IEEE, there are now whole sections with voltage and power regulation functions. So here is a summary of the grid support functions that are being tested for UL1741 SA. So we have our two main categories, ride-through and then voltage regulation and power functions. And lastly, we have anti-islanding, which isn't a really new thing. So for ride-throughs, we have our low and high voltage ride-through, and then we have our low and high frequency ride-through. So this is a modern monitoring voltage and frequency that exceeds your nominal range. So if the AC grid voltage or frequency, high or low limits are exceeded, the inverter must meet the mandatory and permissive operation requirements, as well as the must trip limits. So, like I said, if your voltage exceeds that nominal range or goes below that nominal range, the inverter used to just trip offline and be on a 5-minute timer before reconnecting, but now it's saying, hey, let's wait it out a little bit longer. So you're just riding through a little bit longer, and the ride-through times are dependent on your jurisdiction. So not only are these functions riding through, but they're also operating at the same time. So they're trying to assist the grid to restabilize it while it's beyond its nominal range. And I have a slide that has an example of this that will be a good depiction of what's going on. The next is voltage regulation and power functions. So we have our soft start ramp rates and normal ramp rates. So it's the rate of power increase when first ramping and then subsequent increase in offsetting or selling. So these inverters are to transition their power output at a predetermined pace. So this is just preventing any rapid changings for the power system. So that can lead to large-scale disconnections. This is mostly applicable for maybe at startup when the sun is rising or after a disturbance. If your inverter does, trip offline, it's just ramping up instead of just reconnecting with full power. The next item is specified power factor. So this is specified by the utility or jurisdiction, and this depends on what type of loads the utilities are servicing of that local grid or in that local grid. The next three are volt var, volt watt, and frequency watt. So these are a response to a voltage that is exceeding that nominal range or frequency that's exceeding the nominal range. So for volt var, we have a response to the grid voltage with the inverter reactive power. For volt watt, we have a response to the grid voltage with inverter watts. And for frequency watt, we have the response to the grid frequency with inverter watts. So these functions are dependent on the voltage and frequency that go beyond the voltage or frequency nominal limits. Lastly, we have anti-islanding, so protection to ensure the inverter does not backfeed a disabled grid. Not all grids are the same. The settings that will be required will not be identical throughout the world. So some functions will be enabled or disabled, and the settings for the functions will be different for each region. So as you can see here, HECO requires 2 additional functions that California does not require, and that's because those grids are different. One requirement from HECO, just something to note, that isn't part of this, UL1741 SA test standard, is remote disconnect and connect, which these type of functions will be in the new IEEE 1547. So this is just to show that, the comparison between Hawaii and California and whatever new utility might also adopt their own version of this, that it's not going to all be the same. It just depends on what the area's needs are. Great. Here we have an example, an illustrative example of previous versions of IEEE 1547. Inverters were mandated to be twitchy or reactionary. So if they were slightly out of range, required by previous versions, they were to immediately disconnect, trip offline, and be on a 5-minute timer. So as you can see, that nominal band, as soon as they exceeded that, they were out. Everyone out of the pool. So things are a little bit different now. We'll see that in the next slide. Here is an illustrative example of the new grid support behaviors. So this is a voltage example. If the AC grid voltage high or low limits are exceeded, the inverter must meet the mandatory and permissive operation requirements, as well as the must trip limits. So we still have our nominal voltage range that we saw in the previous slide. So for this example, when your voltage drops below that window, the inverter is to remain connected. So let's take a look at the range between 50% and 70% of your nominal voltage. So for a 120 volt nominal, that's 60 volts to 84 volts. So here the inverter must remain connected for at least 10 seconds. However, you must disconnect by the 11th second. During this ride-through period, the inverter must meet the mandatory operation. So the inverter is riding through, but it's also operating at the same time. So it's trying to assist the grid to restabilize. This operation for this voltage example could be volt-watt for your area. So that means that the inverter is pushing power to the grid when the voltage dips. So now let's say this per this example that you're below 50% nominal voltage. So which means you're below 60 volts. The inverter must remain connected for at least 1 second now. In this region, however, it doesn't have to operate, but the utility would like you to help if the inverter can. So the inverter must disconnect to the grid by the second. So during this time, the inverter is just a conductor. So this is the permissive operation referenced in ride-throughs. The permissive operation, or the help if you can but don't disconnect, is beneficial because the inverter doesn't trip during this time. So in this example, we're talking about a low voltage but below 50% nominal. So what this means is that when the voltage returns back above this region, the inverter can immediately help again or operate as usual. This must operate and permissive operation, this will be determined by your local jurisdiction or your utility. So this is just an illustrative example. This slide is information from EPRI. This is a great depiction on how grid support helps the grid and the market. So on the left is an area with PV at unity power, which means power factor of 1. On the right, we have the same area, but you have volt-var functionality. So here you can see you almost double the penetration before you hit the red area, and there are less instances where you're over the maximum feeder voltage. So the main message here is that with grid support functions, it will help prevent destabilization of the grid, which means more time for your inverters to produce or sell, and you're also able to add more PV in an area. All right, so now we're on to the next section. So what's the timing of all of this? So now we're going to take a look at the smart inverter journey, or grid support functionality development journey. So starting off on the far left, we have September 2011, California Public Utilities Commission revises Rule 21 to support smart inverters, which is also grid support functionality. Jumping to December 2014, California Public Utility Commissions, they require smart inverters 12 months after the test standard is developed and published. And this is UL1741 SA. So work on the test standard starts in July 2015. And now during that development, HECO or Hawaii, they say that they will also require smart inverters 12 months after the test standard. Well, the UL1741 SA is published September 2016, which leads us for it to become effective September 2017. So here we have California and Hawaii. So those are the two states that are requiring grid support functionality. And actually, this will apply in most areas in California. There's actually pockets in California where this does not apply. And more utility zones besides outside of California and Hawaii are actually piloting smart or advanced inverter technology. Actually, I just got an email last week about a utility company in Pennsylvania that's currently collecting a list of UL1741 SA compliant inverters so that they can enforce a new smart inverter policy starting in September. So we'll see what happens with that. The message here is, know what's going on in your area. SA or grid support functionality could be around the corner. Something to be aware of too is that once the new IEEE 1547 is published, these functions will be required nationally. All right, so now we're going to be talking about specifically how California will be implementing this and how Hawaii will be implementing this in September. They're both implementing this differently. So first, let's going to start out with Hawaii. So HECO Rule 14H. So just a little bit of background. Rule 14H refers to Hawaiian Electric Company's Tariff Rule 14, Paragraph H, interconnection of distributed generating facilities with company's distribution system. So all inverters interconnected under CSS or CGS after October 2015 in Hawaii must update their system on September 8th to provide grid support functions. So by update, HECO is allowing retroactive firmware updates for installations that occurred during this time with no markings, just a firmware upgrade. It's okay. So anytime between October 2015 and September up to September 7th, you're required to do a firmware update to your system if you're interconnected. So starting September 8th, all new installations will require inverters to be listed and marked to UL1741 SA for grid support utility interactive inverters. So remember, this must be starting September 8th. It has to be listed and marked. California Rule 21. So Rule 21, it's not new. If you're interconnected in California today, you're likely following it. It did get updated, and that's why there's a supplement to UL 1741. So California is different than Hawaii. They're doing it differently. So starting September 8th, applications for interconnection will require inverters to be listed to UL 1741 SA. Applications before that date can use any inverter that's on the CEC list approved equipment. You don't need to worry about a listed product. You're grandfathered in. I just want to reiterate, this is not for units already installed, only for new installations that had applications starting September 8th. All right, our next section is Outback Solutions. Outback's inverters are advanced enough to have the ability to support these new features. They're inverters you've already installed before, but now with new grid support functionality. So they have the same form factor, they have the same spare parts. We're also providing GIP files that will streamline settings for your area, and I'll go over that a little bit more detail later. All right, so now we're going to be talking about product availability. So we will be having the Radian and FXR models available in September 2017. We are doing pre-sale, so we're accepting orders now. It will be a first come, first served basis. There will be a transitional period where both non-SA and SA products will be available to order, and that's actually right now. So you might see the -01 at the end of our models. That is indicating that you are ordering a product that is UL1741 SA listed and marked. Your POs and box label is another location where you will be able to identify if you have an inverter that is listed. And lastly, our inverters will have an indication on the inverter itself that it has grid support functions. So look out for the grid support utility interactive inverter/charger on our product labels. We're also adding a label that will make it easier for you to identify as having grid support functionality, and that's that black one on the far right. So we're just trying to make it really easy for you to have high confidence that you're getting an order that is UL1741 SA listed. So here's some technical information. So GIP files, they will streamline settings for your area. So we're going to be providing this on our website. So GIP stands for Grid Interface Protection. It contains the parameters for a specific regional grid intertie. So we'll have a profile for your jurisdictions to ensure that you are compliant for your area. And I'll go over that in the next slide too. So if you are replacing an inverter in an older system, so let's say you have a multi-inverter system and you're replacing an older inverter with a new -01 or SA inverter, you will need to upgrade your other inverter's firmware revision with a Mate 3S. So if you have a large system with multiple inverters, you need to be on the same firmware level. So another thing to note is that you must use the Mate 3S or access port for grid support inverters. You cannot use the Mate 3 for these new inverters. So GIP files are grid interface protection files. I just want to start out saying that we will be releasing an instructional video on how to upload a GIP file, but I'll go over it at a high level right now. So you start with a blank SD card. You go to outbackpower.com and upload the GIP file for your jurisdiction. Then you upload these preset parameters using your Mate 3S to update your inverter's grid support settings. And that's it. So we're really trying to make this easy for you. And like I said, we will also be releasing a video on this as well. So we're at the end of our presentation now. Just to summarize, we talked about a lot of things, but overall we talked about what is SA. And what SA is essentially a test standard referring to UL1741 SA, and it's testing grid support functionality, and that's really what the utilities want from these interconnected inverters. We talked about what the timing of all of this is and how it affects you specifically in Hawaii and California, and we also talked about Outback Solutions. That's all that we have for today. Thank you so much for your time. Again, I'm Gwendolyn Espy. I'm an applications engineer here at Outback Power, and I hope that you found this valuable. Thanks.